applying our standards. Thank you once again to everyone and to Ecuador.
Muchas gracias, Joao. También queremos la presentación de Ron Smith, quien nos va a dirigir unas pocas palabras.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ross Smith. I'm a member of the staff and I'm the IPSASB Deputy Director. It's nice to meet everyone virtually today on this first FOCAL webinar. Thank you to everyone for your time and effort in attending this event. It's great to engage with the FOCAL group, which is a very important group that allows IPSASB to engage with Latin America. FOCAL is a key group, the IPSASB to engage with, and is very much what the IPSASB had in mind when it developed its regional engagement strategy as part of its strategy and work plan 2019-2023. Thank you to Joao Fonseca for his hard work and efforts in pulling together this event from the IPSASB side, as well as his dedication and commitment to engagement with IPSASB stakeholders in Latin America. And just echoing the thanks that Joao shared to the hosts today, thank you very much from the IPSASB for making this event happen. Thank you.
May, no se te escucha. Y ahora sí te veo.
Hello, Magdalena.
Y les decía que de acuerdo a la agenda,
Ahora sí se escucha.
la presentación de cada país, una presentación corta, dado que la videoconferencia tiene una duración de apenas 1 hora. La presentación por país va a ser muy corta. Empecemos por Paraguay.
Hola, sí, buenas tardes. Rápidamente, soy María Teresa Agüero, directora general de Contabilidad Pública, y me acompaña el jefe de Consolidación Contable, que es el licenciado Ángel Gómez. Y me encanta verles. Gracias.
México, por favor. México, si nos escucha. Juan.
¿Qué tal? Sí, a todos. Espero que sí me estén escuchando. Juan Torres García, contador público, titular de la Unidad de Contabilidad Gubernamental en la Secretaría de Hacienda y Crédito Público en la Ciudad de México. Mucho gusto.
César. César, Argentina.
Yo les voy a poner en el chat.
César, por favor, si nos escuchas.
¿Ahora me escuchan?
Sí.
César Duro, contador general de la Nación de la República Argentina. Me acompaña la contadora Patricia Castro, directora de Normas y Sistemas. Un saludo para todos.
Ronald, Costa Rica. Ronald.
No te escuchamos, Ronald.
El micrófono.
¿Me escuchan? Sí. Ahora sí. Buenas tardes a todos. Soy Ronald Fernández, el director de Contabilidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Me acompaña don Jesús, que es el jefe de la Unidad de Consolidación, don Miguel, que es parte de la Unidad de Consolidación, y doña Mayela, que son parte de la Unidad de Consolidación. Un gusto saludarlos a todos.
Chile. Araceli. Chile. Araceli, Panamá. Araceli. Bueno, mientras se conecta Araceli. Chile, por favor.
Buenas tardes, soy Gustavo Smith, jefe del área de normas de la Contraloría General, y bastantes personas de mi equipo se están conectando a través de sus computadores.
Gracias. Araceli.
Pedro ya está. Colombia.
Pedro. Te escuchamos, Pedro. Tenemos problemas, pues no nos escuchan, tal vez no tienen abierto el audio y la cámara. Bianca, ¿nos escuchas?
Sí, perfecto, escucho perfectamente. Esperemos que tanto Chile, Panamá y Colombia nos escuchen. Bueno, me presento con todos. Mi nombre es Bianca Merchán, especialista financiera del BID acá en Washington.
José.
Buenas tardes a todos. José Res, que es especialista en gestión financiera pública para el equipo de Latinoamérica del Banco Mundial. Voy a estar acompañándolos por parte del Banco Mundial durante este año en ausencia de límite. Mucho gusto y esperemos trabajar juntos en el futuro.
Andrés.
Buenas tardes, Andreas Bergman de Zurich.
Gracias.
¿Está Camila?
Camila. Ah, ya llegó. Heriberto.
Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Me escuchan?
Sí.
Espera.
¿Cómo estás, Heriberto?
Yo creo que yo estoy también con Leonardo de Brasil, que está en conectado, yo creo. También.
Gracias. Camila.
Buenas tardes a todos, Camila Sánchez desde EY, Alemania. Y saludos también de parte de Tomás Müller, que hoy no pudo participar en la videoconferencia.
Muchas gracias. Creo que todos nos hemos presentado. Yo estoy con todo el personal de la Subsecretaría de Contabilidad Gubernamental y quería aprovechar todos los temas que se van a tratar en esta videoconferencia. Damos paso a Carlos Troya, que nos va a dar el mecanismo de la videoconferencia.
Gracias. Buenas tardes con todos. El mecanismo sería primero que lo que vamos a hacer es dar el paso a Joao, que él va a poner en línea para que todos podamos ver el video en inglés. Como previamente ya habíamos transmitido a todos ustedes el archivo que corresponde.
Or indirectly, through controlled entities, 20% or more of the voting power of the investee, it is presumed that the entity has significant influence, unless it can be clearly demonstrated that it is not the case. Conversely, if the entity holds directly or indirectly through controlled entities less than 20% of the voting power of the investee, it is presumed that the entity does not have significant influence, unless such influence can be clearly demonstrated. A substantial or majority ownership by another investor does not necessarily preclude an entity from having significant influence. Given the importance of the control concept, let's take a look in more detail the three elements of control. Regarding power, an entity has power over another entity when the entity has existing rights that give it the current ability to direct the relevant activities. For example, the activities that significantly affect the nature or amount of the benefits from its involvement with the other entity. However, the existence of rights over another entity does not necessarily give rise to power for the purposes of IPSAS 35. For example, an entity does not have power over another entity solely due to the existence of regulatory control or economic dependence. Regulatory control does not usually give rise to power over an entity for the purposes of IPSAS 35. However, when regulation is so tight as to effectively dictate how the entity performs its business, then it may be necessary to consider whether the purpose and design of the entity is such that it is controlled by the regulating entity. Economic dependence alone does not give rise to power over an entity for the purposes of IPSAS 35. An entity may be able to influence the financial and operating policies of another entity that is dependent on it for funding. However, a combination of factors will need to be considered to determine whether the economic dependence is such that the economically dependent entity no longer has the ultimate power to govern its own financial or operating policies. Regarding benefits, an entity is exposed or has rights to variable benefits from its involvement with an entity being assessed for control when the benefits that it seeks from its involvement have the potential to vary as a result of the other entity's performance. Regarding the link between power and benefits, an entity controls another entity if the entity not only has power over the entity being assessed for control and exposure of rights to variable benefits from its involvement with the other entity, but also has the ability to use its power to affect the nature or amount of the benefits from its involvement with the entity being assessed for control. This means that the existence of congruent objectives alone is insufficient for an entity to conclude that it controls another entity. In order to have control, the entity would also need to have the ability to use its power over the entity being assessed for control to direct that other entity to work with it to further its objectives. An entity's investment in another entity determines which accounting applies. For a controlled entity, it applies consolidation accounting. For an investment in an associate or joint venture, it applies equity method. For a joint operation, it is accounting for assets and liabilities. If it has significant influence, it applies the equity method. If it has lack of influence, then it applies IPSAS 2941 or other IPSAS as appropriate. In all cases, disclosed in accordance with IPSAS 38 and other relevant IPSAS. Entities with controlled entities or investments in associates or joint ventures may present separate financial statements in accordance with IPSAS 34. For us to better understand how the concept of control applies in practice and its relationship with the concept of economic entity, let's take a look at the following example. Entity A controls entity B and C. Entities B and C control entities D and E and entities F and G, respectively. The economic entity encompasses the controlling entity and its controlled entities, as shown in the elliptic figure. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground so far in terms of the main concepts on consolidation. Let's dive now into some common practical questions that arise from these concepts. The first question is there a need or not to consolidate central banks? Well, an assessment needs to be made whether the legal framework that governs the central bank in the specific jurisdiction gives rise to control by government. For example, in the UK, the central bank is controlled by the government. However, in other jurisdictions, this might not be the case. The second question is, should a jurisdiction with three levels of government, federal, provincial or state, and municipalities, consolidate? In principle, no, but there may be exceptions. In normal circumstances, the federal government does not control the lower level of government if they have autonomy on their operating and financial policies, unless there is an agreement that gives the federal government de facto control of the lower level of government. For example, a financially distressed municipality signs an agreement with the federal government releasing policies in exchange of financial assistance and thus helping to meet the fiscal targets of the general government sector. In other countries, on accounting requirements. The main consolidation procedures are combine like assets, liabilities, net assets equity, revenues, expenses, and cash flows. Eliminate investments in controlled entities. Eliminate balances and transactions between entities of the economic entity. If necessary, adjust to conform accounting policies. If necessary, adjust for significant transactions between financial statement dates. Identify non-controlling interests in surplus or deficit and net assets and equity. There are two approaches to consolidation. The first one is to consolidate the whole group of entities at the same time at the top controlling entity level. The second approach is to consolidate bottom-up. The whole group consolidation means that you apply the consolidation procedures seen earlier to all entities, irrespective of their relative position in the economic entity. For example, in this example, you consolidate entities A to G in any given order. Bottom-up consolidation means that you apply the consolidation procedures first to entities B, D, and E, and C, F, and G. Afterwards, you apply the consolidation procedures to entity A and the resulting economic entities of B and C. Let's look at an example of consolidation procedures. Government transfers 100 to a department. Government debits expense 100 and credits cash 100. The department debits cash 100 and credits revenue 100. The department purchases an asset for 90 and pays salaries of 10. The department then transfers that purchased asset to a controlled entity. The controlled entity recognizes asset and revenue of 90. When consolidating, only the transactions outside of the square are to be captured in the economic entity, and the transactions between government, department, and controlled entity need to be eliminated. Now, let's see the accounting requirements for acquisitions, disposals, and loss of control. Revenues and expenses of controlled entity are included from date of acquisition. Revenues and expenses included until date control ceases during reporting period. Gain or loss reported on disposal of controlled entity. If control ceases, controlled entity accounted for as a financial asset. IPSAS 35 has specific guidance on investment entities. An investment entity is an entity that obtains funds from one or more investors for the purpose of providing those investors with investment management services. Has the purpose of investing funds solely for returns from capital appreciation, investment revenue, or both, and measures and evaluates the performance of substantially all of its investments on a fair value basis. An investment entity that is a controlling entity measures an investment in a controlled entity at fair value through surplus or deficit in accordance with IPSAS 29 or IPSAS 41. Except if controlled entity that provides services related to the investment activities. An investment entity determining whether an entity is an investment entity by assessing all effects and circumstances. An investment entity discloses the significant judgment and assumptions made in determining that it is an investment entity, unless it has all the following characteristics. It has obtained funds from more than one investor. It has ownership interests in the form of equity or similar interests, and it has more than one investment. Regarding the accounting for a change in investment entity status, when an entity ceases to be an investment entity, it shall apply IPSAS 40, public sector combinations, to any controlled entity that was previously measured at fair value through surplus or deficit, in accordance with paragraph 56. The date of the change of status shall be deemed the acquisition date. The fair value of the controlled entity at the deemed acquisition date shall represent the transferred deemed consideration when measuring any goodwill or gain from a bargain purchase that arises from the deemed acquisition. IPSAS 38, Disclosure of Interests in Other Entities, provides the guidance on disclosures. The entity shall disclose significant judgments and assumptions made, and information about its interests in controlled entities, joint arrangements and associates, structured entities that are not consolidated, non-quantifiable ownership interests, and controlling interests acquired with the intention of disposal. The question number 3 is, how are the valuation methods of inventories, depreciation, amortization, revaluation of assets, in case different entities use different measurement bases? Well, when consolidating, the controlling entity will need to adjust the accounting policies of the controlled entities to the accounting policies of the controlling entity. This means that the controlling entity will need to adjust all the recognition and measurement requirements of the controlled entities to conform with accounting policies of the controlling entity. The question number 4 is, what is the role of the trial balance within the consolidation process, its structure and importance in the said consolidation process? The role of the trial balance is to assist in the consolidation procedures by identifying and quantifying the elements of the financial statements that will need to be included and or adjusted in the consolidation. Regarding its structure, it is important to have the information on assets, liabilities, revenue, expense, net assets, equity, results, and related parties. Because of the information that it provides, the trial balance is very important in the consolidation process. The main takeaways of this webinar are: IPSAS 35 applies to controlling entities, but with some exceptions. It is important to distinguish control from joint control from significant influence in the type of interests in other entities. The economic entity includes the controlling entity and the controlled entities. Eliminate all transactions and balances within the economic entity, and adjust the accounting policies of the controlled entity to conform with the accounting policies of the controlling entity. Thank you for viewing this webinar. For further information, please visit our webpage www.ipsasb.org. Goodbye.
Muchas gracias, Joao. Ahora iniciamos con las preguntas de todos los participantes a través del chat. Cintia va a estar pendiente de todas las preguntas y les va a dar la prioridad conforme vayan presentando las preguntas. Teníamos unas preguntas que ya nos presentó. Joao.
Sí, Magdalena.
Tenía una pregunta,
I had a question. Heriberto had a question. And I think the answer is already in the presentation, in the PowerPoint file. That was about the central bank.
Nadie está enviando preguntas por el chat, entonces si lo puede hacer verbalmente.
Aquí vamos a tener una pregunta. Una pregunta de Ecuador.
Una pregunta de Ecuador.
A question from Ecuador.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Mi pregunta es que podemos
if we can
simplificar
put an example
el método que se plantea
The method
de la eliminación de saldos y
about
transacciones
elimination
dentro de
and
la
transaction
actividad económica.
inside of the economic entity.
Sorry, can you please repeat, Carlos?
Yes, of course.
La pregunta es que si podemos ejemplificar.
Carlos, let me hear the person speaking, and then you do the translation afterwards.
Okay, do it.
Because there is lagging in the communication and both overlap, and I cannot hear both.
Mi pregunta es que si se puede ejemplificar el método que se está planteando ahí, que es de la eliminación de transacciones recíprocas dentro de la actividad, dentro de una entidad económica.
Okay. Did you understand, Joao? That was fine?
Yes. Io comprendo la pregunta. So I'll speak in English now. So those two approaches, they are optional, and it is to be used by the entity, whichever option suits best their needs, and it's easy for applying the accounting procedures. So that is why that it depending of the how many entities do you need to consolidate, and depending on how many levels of consolidation that you have to do within the economic group, one method or the other might vary according to its complexity of consolidation. So, for example, when you have a group or an economic entity that has several levels beneath it of controlling entities, it is easier to consolidate from bottom up, on level by level until the top, for two reasons. First, because if you have controlling entities at the lower levels, that might require also to report those consolidated financial statements. You already be doing those first set of consolidated financial statements. That is the first reason. The second reason is once you do all those lower levels of consolidation, it will be easier then to do the last level of the controlling entity that it is on top, because all the work that you did below, it's already done, and then you only need to make the consolidation procedures between the ultimate controlling entity and those intermediate controlling entities. Hope it is clear.
There's another question from Chile.
Sí.
Gustavo.
¿Quién va primero?
Gustavo.
Another question from Gustavo Smith, Joao, from Chile.
Sí.
Un gobierno debería consolidar los poderes legislativos. A government should consolidate the legislative and the judicial powers.
So once again, we need to assess the control criteria into those entities. So first, we need to know if those are reporting entities, the judicial powers and the legislative, and then so that is the first step. If they are reporting entities, and then the second step is we'll need to assess the whole legal framework of that country to assess whether there is or not control from one government, from one type of power towards the other. So I don't have one size fits all solution. So because that assessment needs to be done on a case by case basis.
There's another question from Maria Celi Méndez, and she says, from Panama.
Disculpen, no van a traducir al español las respuestas porque yo no entiendo nada.
Sí vamos a traducir, disculpa María Teresa, ya vamos a traducir inmediatamente. La siguiente pregunta es, the following question, Joao, is how is defined the control about or above other entity? Excuse me, Joao, did you hear that?
Yes, I'm thinking.
Okay.
Well,
excuse me, Joao. First, we're going to hear what you have to say, of course, in English, and then I'm going to translate to Spanish.
Yes. So you haven't translated my previous answers. I don't know if you want to do any translation.
Yes. Maybe we can return again for the first and second issues after all the questions are completed.
Okay. So you'll do the translation in the end.
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
All right. So, well, once again, it depends on the situation, because when an entity loses control, we need to know what does that mean, loss of control. Is it a change in the influence over the other entity? So was there any type of modification from control to joint control, or for significant influence? Question mark. So we need to know what is the change in that loss of control, and for that I've already given in my presentation. So what it can be done in those types of situations in terms of the types of accounting applied to each and every one. And the other option is whether you simply do not have joint control, you do not have significant influence, you in the end lack any type of influence. So in that case, it is treated as a financial asset, and IPSAS 29 and 41 will be applied. Another situation in terms of loss of control is whether it was simply sold its interest, all the interest in that controlled entity. And if that is the case, a gain or a loss on that sale needs to be calculated. So it is always depending on the specific situation.
Thank you, Joao. I would like to point that there is too much concepts to be explained. So if we can do first one concept developed and then continue with the following concept in the solution. Please, I'm going to translate right now that answer to the third question, but then please we have to do it little by little. Did you hear me, Joao? Please.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes. A la pregunta de cómo se define el control sobre otra entidad de Araceli, decía Joao que todo depende en primer lugar, porque él estaba hablando de la pérdida de control, cómo está la base legal primero del país, como tal y como en las preguntas anteriores. Segundo, había que ver si es que los activos de la entidad y en general los detalles financieros de la entidad tienen que ver con una entidad controlada y controlada precisamente por una entidad controladora. Así que la definición del control o la pérdida de control, que es lo que se dijo hace un momento, lo que decía Joao, es algo que tiene que ver precisamente con esa posibilidad de conocer todos sus activos y de tener influencia sobre ellos. Eso en resumen lo que ha dicho Joao en su respuesta. That's it, Joao. Then we have another question, Joao. In the public sector, this is from Oscar from Peru. In the public sector, there are, excuse me one moment, please. In the public sector, there are three accounting models that consolidate: IFRS, IPSAS, and the financial with the banks. How to make uniform accounting policies for consolidation? That's the question.
And it's a very good question. So,
es una pregunta muy buena.
Sí. So Well, once again, there are several layers. There are several layers to this response. Of course, at entity level, each entity might have its accounting framework by law to be applied, whether it is IFRS or whether it is IPSAS, and even if there is a specific accounting guidelines for banks, at the reporting entity level, they need to apply those. So, yeah, please translate this, Carlos.
Hay una infraestructura sobre cuál de las modalidades de consolidación es posible, ya sea NIF, ya sea NIGSP, o sea la contabilidad financiera para los bancos. Y hay que actuar en esas tres capas posibles.
Sí. Then the second thing that we need to know is that, okay, if there is a controlling entity on top of these controlled entities, then what the controlling entity needs to do is to adjust all the accounting policies, all the accounts of those entities that are using IFRS or even accounting standards for banks, and according to the accounting policies of the ultimate controlling entity. And that is a procedure that it is done within the consolidation process. And that is what IPSAS 35 says. Yes, please, Carlos, translate this.
Yes. Primero hay que saber si existen entidades controladoras y entidades controladas. Si es que es así, entonces primero hay que ajustar la contabilidad, ya sea en modelo NIF, en modelo NIGSP o en modelo de contabilidad financiera para la banca, sobre la base de lo que disponga la entidad o de las entidades controladoras. De esa forma podríamos tener una uniformidad. Esa es la primera parte.
See, thanks, Carlos. Then, after we do that, then it is possible to do the eliminations of all transactions and balances between all those entities in order to capture the whole economic entity, just like I've said in my presentation. To finalize my answer, I just want to highlight that IPSASB has on its website a staff question and answers that precisely answers these questions on consolidation with controlled entities that apply different accounting frameworks that are not IPSAS, might be IFRS, that might be national accounting standards or even standards from banks. And it is, I would suggest to everyone to go to our website and search for that staff question and answers, because it provides more detail on this and might be helpful for all of you.
Okay. La tercero que hay que considerar es si es posible que las transacciones y los saldos sean eliminados entre esas transacciones para llegar a la consolidación. Al revisar la página web de IPSASB, tendré en un lugar en donde se vierten o están escritos las preguntas frecuentes, las frequent asked questions, las FAQ. Se puede encontrar mayor detalle sobre esto y cómo debería considerarse los diferentes niveles de consolidación, incluyendo la idea de la eliminación recíproca y las transacciones internas en este proceso de consolidación.
One last thing, it is also important when doing the consolidation procedures to take into consideration the materiality levels that we are talking about. So for that, IPSAS also have guidance on materiality, and we also have a staff question and answers on materiality that will assist the preparers in preparing those consolidated financial statements. Once again, I say to everyone, go to our website. We have those two staff question and answers, one on consolidation of controlled entities that apply different accounting frameworks, and another on materiality, and read both together because they provide a very good guidance for consolidation.
Otro aspecto que es necesario topar es el aspecto de materialidad, que hay que tomar en cuenta muy claramente durante el proceso de consolidación. Otra vez, les sugiero que revisen la página web de ISASB. Ahí está desarrollado con mayor profundidad el concepto de materialidad, de forma que puedan ver varias guías de cómo funciona la consolidación y que les proporcione específicamente, precisamente, una guía de cómo proceder con el aspecto adicional de materialidad. That's it, Joao. There is another question from... Yeah. Hay otra pregunta de Araceli Méndez de Panamá que dice, ¿qué pasa si una entidad controladora, ¿qué pasa si una entidad controladora pierde el control de una entidad controlada? We would want to see if there's a country that have another possible participation to transmit an answer for this question. If there is not, we're going to translate that to Joao so he can participate in the right answer. Is there another, ¿hay algún país que tenga tal vez la respuesta a esta pregunta? ¿Qué pasa si una entidad controladora pierde el control de una entidad controlada? In English, the question says, Joao, what happens if a controlling entity loses control of a controlled entity?
Carlos, are we waiting for someone of focal countries to answer?
Yes, there seems to be no country with that answer.
So, as I said earlier, well, once again, it will depend on what it means by controlling, by losing the control. As I said in my presentation, the entity might lose control, but might have been a modification of the type of influence over the other entity. So might lose control, but might gain joint control, might gain significant influence, or might have a lack of influence at all, but still keeping any type of interest in the entity, or might have lost any type of influence, so a pure sale of whole interest in the entity. So according to any of these types of loss of control and its modifications in terms of the type of influence, then we have the specific type of accounting that we need to apply. That is also in my presentation.
Okay, Joao, I'm going to translate that.
Yes.
Lo primero, como se decía en la presentación mismo, inicialmente, o en lo que se vio en el video, lo primero es saber qué es perder control. Entonces, puede ser que perdamos parte del control en la influencia significativa, o que perdamos el control en la información que se tiene de las entidades controladas, o a su vez que haya una combinación de ambas. De todas formas, la pérdida del control es relativa de acuerdo a estos dos conceptos.
Sí, muchas gracias. Thank you. Hello, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Ross, how are you? Thank you so much for this support. It's very important for FOCAL and all countries members from FOCAL. My colleague asked me if candidate ask this question. So sorry because I don't can connect, or I will disconnect in the middle of the explanation. I can to connect 15 minutes after. No, so sorry, we don't follow your presentation from the beginning. The question, the main issue in the question is, after you present the report, the consolidation report, how you adjust the next time when the controlled entity separate for different reasons when it's happened by law, and to convert an other entity, in the middle of the process where you need to consolidate your next statement for the next period.
Yeah, thanks for the detailed question. Carlos, do you want to translate to everyone first?
Yo quisiera que por favor Araceli mismo lo diga en español, de forma que todos puedan decir la totalidad o escuchar la totalidad de la pregunta.
Con gusto, Carlos. Sí. La pregunta la estoy resumiendo porque el equipo que tengo aquí en la sala estaba interesado en conocer más detalles y quizás con la presentación de Joao eso se dio definitivamente, pero como estuvimos desconectados por 15 minutos aproximadamente, tuvimos la explicación de la presentación. Por tanto, la pregunta se concentra específicamente en qué pasa cuando tú has presentado un reporte con una unidad o una entidad controlada y en el siguiente periodo o en el medio del periodo para presentar el siguiente periodo, los estados financieros o la información, hay separación de una entidad controlada. ¿Cómo se definen esos ajustes? Si a partir de una fecha, o sea, ya no es comparable, ¿qué pasa? Esa es la pregunta.
Thank you, Araceli.
You're welcome.
Carlos, can I answer?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, now I understand better your question. So it's about the timing of the loss of that control. And I'm going to give a simple example, imagining that halfway in the year, the controlling entity sells the interest completely in the controlled entity, whether it is by contract or by law or whatever, it has lost completely. So what it needs to be done.
Let me translate that.
Yes.
O Araceli, no sé si tú quieres traducir, tal vez.
Ok. Sí, o sea que depende todo de el tiempo, el momento en que se está dando la separación, o sea, la pérdida de ese poder, de ese control. Y de allí van surgiendo los demás pasos que debes dar, que es lo asumo que es lo que va a explicar Joao después, ¿no?
See, so at the time of the reporting entity, where the controlling entity it is reporting, so the flows, so revenues and expenses, they need to be, while it was under the control, they need to be also eliminated, because all those flows existed throughout that period. And if and the stocks, so the activos y pasivos, they all need to be taken eliminated, but in this case, not because of consolidation, but because it is no longer controlled. So the entity should not be there as a controlled entity, because the entity at the time that it is publishing the accounts, it's no longer controlled. So it is treated like that. So
sí. Esto, el movimiento de cuentas que haya entre stock y flujos es la que te va a ir dando las bases o la guía para poder ir saliendo de ese control. O sea, tienes que definir exactamente cómo quedan afectados tus activos y pasivos para poder consolidar adecuadamente sin la entidad que controlabas.
The other situation is when there is not a loss of control, but there is a modification of control. So from control to joint control or significant influence, then the accounting procedures need also to be modified, because it is no longer elimination of transactions and balances, but it is applied the equity method. So that is why that we need to see what is a situation that leads to the loss of control, because depending of what is a situation that leads to the loss of control, then the accounting also changes.
Correcto. Esto, en la medida que vas, ¿cómo podríamos decir? Definiendo esto, cómo se va perdiendo ese control, ¿no? Vas ajustando en o sea, no sé si es un periodo más corto, cómo definir eso, pero esto, la información que vas obteniendo de esa entidad que pierde control, esto te va definiendo el momento en que debes hacer los ajustes, ¿no? Ahí no lo tuve muy claro, pero esto creo que no es una situación de quitar y poner nada más, sino ver qué pesos tiene cada movimiento que se está haciendo de esa entidad que va a salir del control en los tiempos en que se dieron los hechos, ¿no?
Disculpen que me meta en este tema, pero para tomar un ejemplo práctico de pérdida de control y el que vos estás consultando, Araceli, un ejemplo podría ser el tema de privatización, o qué tipo de ejemplo se puede tomar para pérdida de control.
Perdón, no creo que la privatización podía ser la pérdida de control, porque allí en la privatización tú haces una liquidación de activos y pasivos, ¿no? Y la pasas y creas legalmente otra entidad, ¿no? Es todo lo contrario, ya tú tienes la entidad controlada de tu parte, ¿no? O sea, tienes una agencia que todos los activos que tiene esa agencia ya forman parte de la entidad controlada. Un ministerio tiene una secretaría cuyos activos y pasivos todos fueron producto de una capitalización que hizo ese ministerio en esa entidad. Entonces esa entidad se convierte en otro ministerio. Cuando esa entidad se convierte en otro ministerio, la entidad controlada, ¿no? Tú tienes que liquidar en una fecha de cierre financiera y presupuestariamente todos esos registros que tú tenías en tus activos consolidados. Entonces lo tienes que pasar, ya sea por venta o ya sea por cierre, simplemente un cierre a esa fecha fuiste dueña, pero de esa fecha en adelante. Lo que pasa es que hay periodos que se cortan. Entonces, ¿cómo se manejan esos periodos cortados en la consolidación? Básicamente, ahí es donde está el issue, el problema.
Araceli, I'm more than happy to talk with you offline about this issue. And if you can forward me the email with a specific situation, I can perhaps better answer to your specific needs. Magdalena, we are already away out of the time. I don't know if anyone wants to make one more question to wrap up the webinar.
We have 3 more questions, Joao, right now. I don't know if you can, will you have time to do that?
Well, it depends. Let's see if the answers are easy or not.
De repente se puede enviar por correo también la respuesta, porque creo que varios de nosotros en algunos aspectos no entendimos la primera parte, ¿verdad? Y bueno, no sé si esto se está grabando o no, ¿verdad? Pero si hay o no posibilidades de tener las preguntas con las respuestas de manera consolidada, y creo que con eso podríamos cortar la sesión, porque
sí, María,
ya llegó la hora.
Sí, María, esa es la recomendación de Joao, que le mandemos la pregunta por correo y él la contestará después. Vamos a seguir con las otras preguntas. Esa es exactamente la sugerencia.
Sí, precisamente lo que vamos a hacer es obtener todas las preguntas consolidadas. Sí. Tendremos la respuesta también.
Sí, perfectamente. Perfecto.
So one last question from Costa Rica would be possible to be answered. Joao?
Joao.
Sí.
Tiempo.
Yes. Do you have the time to just one?
Yeah, one more. Yeah.
Okay. So this is from Costa Rica, from Ronald from Costa Rica. Costa Rica dice si es necesario, Costa Rica dice es necesario saber cuál es el tratamiento de consolidación cuando se tratan de grupos con tratamiento contable NIC-SP y otras con NIC y NIF. The question in English says, it is necessary to know which is the consolidation treatment when we speak about groups with accounting treatment by IPSAS and IARS.
Yes. Once again, if the controlling entity applies IPSAS and the controlled entity apply IAS, then in the consolidation process, those accounting policies need to be adjusted to conform with accounting policies of the IPSAS-based controlled entity accounting policies.
Let me translate that. Lo primero es que hay que saber, lo primero que hay que tomar en cuenta es precisamente tal como en NIC o en NIC-SP, en NIC-NIF, en NIC-SP, la forma en que se hace el tratamiento de la consolidación, que es similar. That's it, Joe, I think.
Yeah, that is all.
Ok, gracias a todos. Vamos a dar las últimas palabras y les agradezco por la atención.
Muchas gracias, Joao. Ha sido muy fructífera tu participación. Ha aclarado muchos conceptos a todos los países, especialmente a nosotros. Como pedía María Teresa, vamos a enviar las preguntas y respuestas en español para que esto nos sirva a todos los países. Un agradecimiento muy especial a Joao por todo su tiempo, todo el tiempo que nos ha brindado en la preparación de la presentación, en las pruebas que hemos hecho y todo el tiempo que ha transcurrido en el día de hoy. A Bianca también un agradecimiento especial por dotarnos de esta tecnología en la que a cualquier día y a cualquier hora podríamos conectarnos si es que en los países miembros de Focal tenemos alguna inquietud, podríamos hacerlo en el momento que querramos. Por lo tanto, Bianca, muchas gracias. Tú estás grabando la presentación, la conferencia, entonces también querríamos que nos participes a todos de esa grabación para tenerla en inglés y en español.
Claro que sí, Magdalena, con mucho gusto. La grabación, entiendo que los primeros minutos no se grabó, pero nada, la mayoría sí está.
Muchas gracias.